Thank you, Bob. I hope that was worth the trip. I'm going to turn the floor over now to Representative Ross Hunter of the 48th District to share sort of a legislative perspective on math education.
Thanks. So my joke for you is we're going to have a test tonight, and you're not allowed to leave until you pass it, and you have to walk us through the mathematics involved in credit default swaps. It wasn't any funnier than his, I'm sorry. So Julie asked me to do tonight was to walk you through the legislative history of this. How many of you have been involved in this group for 2 or more years? All right, so some of you are newer than that, so it's worth doing this. I was thinking I was getting the same audience that we had downstairs 2 years ago, and I didn't want to tell you everything you already knew. A couple of us have been frustrated. Many of us are frustrated in the legislature as a whole, and we have gotten together and have a pretty bipartisan approach to solving this. It's one of those ones where sometimes you can just you can catch a wave and you can make something happen by having a clear proposal, and everyone just says, oh yeah, those guys know what they're doing, we'll just do that. And so Glenn and I were able to pretend that we actually understood this problem and have a clear solution, and by way of sort of personal tub thumping, we were able to pass it. Now, fortunately, it lined up mostly with what we want to do. So you've all seen this piece. It lays out a whole long timeline. I'd say there's a couple of key elements in here. And the first was when we passed a bill that required the superintendent to rewrite the math standards. And for years, ever since I first got in the legislature, we've been listening to people come in and tell us that we needed to have coherent standards, and we got new adjectives every year. Bill Schmidt would come in, who's a rock star, if you ever get a chance to see Bill Schmidt. And he'd say this stuff, and we'd write a bill that said, no, you have to do that, and nothing would change. There was no way to actually grab a hold of the math standards and change what was happening, because it's very hard to describe what you want in words and legislation. So we finally got a bill that we thought did that, and the superintendent wasn't quite so agreeable with us as to what that actually meant. So this last year, we went through a little dance about how we were going to modify the standards and the curriculum approach. And in the way that the legislature works is there are a number of steps that a bill has to go to. It gets introduced in one or the other houses, and we introduced a bill this year both in the House, where I was the prime sponsor, and in the Senate, where Senator McAuliffe was the prime sponsor of the bill. They were identical. They stayed identical at every step of the way. They have to pass through a policy committee, in this case the education committees. Senator McAuliffe is the chair of the education committee. Both of these bills cost money. They cost more than $75,000, so they have to go to the appropriations committee. I serve on the appropriations committee in the House and chair of the revenue committee, so I'm one of the budget guys. Glenn's also on that committee. Glenn's also on the education committee. Every time we would pass this bill, and the bill basically mandated, and we changed the text as we went a little bit, but handed all of the power about determining mathematics standards away from the superintendent over to the State Board of Education, which, as you might expect, got the superintendent somewhat exercised. So each one of these steps, she had an opportunity to comment on the bill. And her staff would dutifully come down and comment about how it was the end of Western civilization. And we would all agree, and we'd move the bill forward one step. And each time, the process got a little bit better. And she would hope that she would make some change and we would lose interest in running the bill. And in fact, had she actually made the said changes that we finally got at the end, we might have, in fact, lost interest in running the bill because there was lots of other work that we had to do. But that didn't occur. So we finally got to the end where each bill passes in its house of origin and then crosses over to the other committee. And you can see I've done this before, so I've got the arm motion worked out. And it starts again in the policy committees and works its way through. So you've got 4 or 5 times that people get to vote on this bill. And finally, at the end, you have to pick one. And we had agreed ahead of time that my version of the bill was going to happen, but the Senate passed their version first and then claimed that they'd run out of time and didn't do ours. But, you know, it turns out not to matter how much, whose name is on it. Glenn and I have worked together closely on this, and my name is first on most of these bills. And that's because the Democrats control the House right now, and I have a greater ability to squeeze the committee chairs to move the bill forward, because I spend more time with them. So were the Republicans in charge, his name would dutifully be first on the list, but the reality is we work together on moving these bills forward. So we exerted more control over the standards approval process and basically required the superintendent to take language from the State Board of Ed. And we've done the same on curriculum. We'll get a little bit further on curriculum. We have to be very careful about how we do this because we have a constitutional mandate in this state that puts the superintendent in charge of education issues, policy issues. Over the last 50 years or so, most power has shifted to the governor with the budget, but we still have this separately elected superintendent, which makes it difficult for everyone to be on the same page. So I will be supporting this year a constitutional amendment to change the role of the superintendent and not have it be a separately elected official, but have it be part of the. And I will do this regardless of who is elected governor. 50 years ago, it made a difference that all the funds were local. Almost all education funding 50 years ago came from local property taxes. There were a lot of problems with that, particularly if you were in a place that didn't have a lot of commercial real estate, your property taxes were very high, or your educational opportunities were very low, which was more likely to be the occurrence. And that has changed over the years to where most funding now comes from the state. Since the budget is determined by a combination of the legislature and the governor, and is administered by the governor's office, I think that that power shift ought to be reflected in the superintendent's office. So that is something that you will see. It may be very difficult to do. It takes 2/3 to modify the Constitution. Fortunately, in this state, we are not allowed to modify the Constitution by initiative. That would be a disaster, and I'm very, very glad we do not have that. We will see if we can make that happen. I would argue, and I'll sit down very quickly so that we can stay actually ahead of schedule,